J.P. Morgan, Robber Baron, or Captain of Industry? Presented by Herman Gonzalez, Jason Ledon, Richard Lopez, Chukwuemeka Okeke, and Jairo Serrano.
Following in his father's footsteps, J.P. Morgan entered the banking industry. Junius Morgan, J.P. Morgan's father, had ties to the merchant industry, and these ties allowed J.P. Morgan to join Duncan, Sherman & Co. Following his successes there, J.P. Morgan was ready to retire, but with his father's insistence, he partnered with Anthony Drexel to create Drexel Morgan & Co. The company they made together would not only become very successful, but also mark the beginning of J.P. Morgan's empire in banking.
The firm is rechristened J.P. Morgan and Company. J.P. Morgan and Philadelphia banker Anthony Drexler formed a private merchant banking partnership in New York called Drexler Morgan & Co. Earliest partnership that involves with J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan is the primary financier of the U.S. railroads. J.P. Morgan creates world's first billion-dollar corporation by buying out the industrialist Andrew Carnegie and combining 33 companies to create United States Steel. J.P. Morgan financed many of the companies that shaped the U.S. economy in the 20th century and helped to restore stability to the volatile financial markets, now known as J.P. Morgan Chase Bank.
The fusion with the steel industry. In 1901, J.P. Morgan created millions of dollars in finance out of thin air by borrowing money from Andrew Carnegie to purchase Carnegie Steel for $480 million. J.P. Morgan merges Carnegie Steel with attorney Albert H. Gary's Federal Steel Company and William Henry Moore's National Steel Company. Combined, the U.S. Steel Company was formed, America's first billion-dollar corporation.
During the Civil War, J.P. Morgan financed the purchase of 5,000 Hall carbines, a certain type of gun, for Simon Stevens. Stevens was supposed to change the caliber of the gun shot and then resell it to a general. J.P. Morgan, knowing that the workmanship would be shoddy and the final product would be overpriced, still agreed to finance the project as he knew he stood to make a sizable profit at the possible expense of a few soldiers. It was later said that some soldiers were injured due to the poor workmanship done on the weapons, speaking to the idea that J.P. Morgan was a robber baron.
The Treasury in Morgan. The Federal Treasury was low on gold due to the Panic of 1893. The dwindling bank control from the railroad boom had caused it. J.P. Morgan, a wealthy entrepreneur who had money in gold from Europe and his banks, decided and proposed to purchase and sell it to the U.S. Treasury to keep it afloat. President Grover disagreed. He rejected his offer and decided it was best to sell bonds. Congress approved Cleveland's decision and began. J.P. Morgan saw it was unfit, a financial disaster. He went back in time and found that a statute from the Civil War allowed a loophole. Him and the Rothschilds joined together, and together sold directly gold to the Treasury. They sold a rough amount of 3.5 million ounces of gold from each other's wealth. J.P. Morgan and the Treasury worked together. Morgan had saved the Treasury in 1985. The unsuccessful ventures of J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan invested in Nikola Tesla, an inventor who promised to build and organize a transatlantic wireless communication device, a system that would push the boundaries of the short-range radio. Morgan invested $150,000. Now, it would be a roughly $4 million with inflation. When he hoped to gain 51% of the patents, Tesla turned around and developed a wireless power transmission system with the invested money. Morgan saw the change in plans as a breach of contract and undercut his funding. The operation failed.
J.P. Morgan's empire consisted of 4 components: his banking affairs, railroads, the American Steel Company, and General Electric. Morgan followed his wealthy father into the banking business in the late 1850s, and in 1871 formed a partnership with banker Anthony Drexel. In 1895, their firm was reorganized as J.P. Morgan & Company, the predecessor of today's J.P. Morgan Chase. Morgan used his influence to help stabilize American financial markets during several economic crises, including the Panic of 1907. During the late 19th century, when the U.S. railroad industry experienced rapid overexpansion and heated competition, Morgan was heavily involved in reorganizing and consolidating many financially troubled railroads. Accordingly, he gained control of significant portions of these railroad stocks and eventually controlled an estimated 1/6 of America's rail lines. The American Steel Company. United States Steel was built by combining 10 different steel companies, including the two largest at the beginning of the 20th century, the Carnegie Steel Company and the Federal Steel Company. The effort to unite these companies was led by J.P. Morgan. He attempted to do this after he had combined several smaller steel companies to form Federal Steel. He then hoped to expand his company by joining forces with Carnegie Steel, founded in 1873 by a Scottish immigrant, Andrew Carnegie. General Electric. During 1889, Thomas Edison had business interests in many electricity-related companies: Edison Lamp Company, Edison Machine Works, Bergman and Company, and Edison Electric Light Company. In 1889, Morgan and Company, a company founded by J.P. Morgan and Anthony Drexel, financed Edison's research and helped merge these companies under one corporation to form Edison General Electric Company. J.P. Morgan, the robber baron. Some think that J.P. Morgan is a robber baron because he, number one, exploited his wealth, as he was often accused of having too much power and was accused of manipulating the nation's financial system for his own gain. His focus was always to benefit himself. While other leaders of business donated, J.P. Morgan used the interest he collected from his bank and the income from the American Steel Company to purchase unnecessary luxuries. One of these luxuries that he was notorious for was his art collection. The Gilded Age Titan spent a significant portion of his wealth amassing a vast art collection that is still famous to this day. And the donations that he did make were often meaningless and just faulty attempts to gain public appeal, such as when he donated guns to the army, but since they were cheap and defective, which he knew, the soldiers needed to find new guns to actually use in the war because they often would be killed themselves trying to use the weaponry that he supplied them with, as they were extremely defective and had no real purpose.
Conclusion. Through his acts of greed and general disconcern for the public, we consider J.P. Morgan, above all, to be a robber baron. Although J.P. Morgan provided funds to keep the U.S. economy, and therefore communities nationwide, stable, and offered donations to the U.S. Army, his redeeming actions were outshone by his ulterior greedy motives. J.P. Morgan was not a captain of industry, he was a manipulator of the industry, all for his own gain.